point behind that. I would much rather see a chemistry department kept open than a philosophy department, because I think whereas the bangs and smells aspect of things in chemistry need some equipment and more special training, people like Hume and Descartes and Berkeley and all that didn't need philosophy departments to do philosophy.
You mentioned Darwin. We're coming up on the bicentennial of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin and so on. Do you have any thoughts about Darwin as a philosopher?
Well, Darwin as a philosopher...
No. As a philosopher, do you have any thoughts about Darwin? But you can do the other one as well, if you like.
Well, of course, I'm a great admirer of Darwin, and I think his life and work is not just important from the point of view of the contribution that he made to the biological sciences, a transforming, revolutionary contribution, really, but also his life and work is in itself iconic in a certain way. Because if you think about his own personal progression from a kind of unreflective, nominal faith, the possibility of going into the church, and then his own realization as he traveled and studied and looked at evidence. Contrast, for example, Darwin's journey, intellectual journey, from a reflex, unquestioning Anglican to an agnostic or indeed atheist, to somebody like Edmund Gosse, who, presented with the same sort of evidence, struggled like mad to hang on to his religious faith and to reinterpret everything in the light of it. Between the two of them, they are, as it were, the opposite poles of something that happens when science really does come into conflict with the ancient stories, the ancient creation myths and the rest. And so there is something very courageous and poignant about Darwin's life, because for a very, very, very long time he kept quiet, realizing the implications of what he was going to say. Very early in the 1840s, he wrote, "I feel as if I've killed God." In a sense, of course, he had. And heaven knows what might have happened if, Russell Wallace hadn't come along and chivied him up a little bit and got him to publish eventually. Perhaps it would have all been posthumous.
I remember in both the cases of Charles Darwin and T.H. Huxley, his bulldog, they both, as happened in Victorian families, lost children. But they were particularly, in Darwin's case, the loss of Annie was a very severe blow for him. And then in Huxley's case, his son was very vibrant, little 9-year-old, was caught with some fever or something, I don't remember exactly. And there's a wonderful exchange of letters, you probably know, between Huxley and Kingsley, in which Kingsley tried to sort of make him feel more comfortable and suggested that he seeks some sort of solace in religion. And there's some wonderful letters from Huxley in which he sort of says basically no, and uses the word agnostic, says he can't get into all that sort of thing, and uses the fact that his sentence about standing before fact like a child, sits before fact like a child, right? Extraordinary, these personal losses creating almost the texts that we now use for understanding sort of this conflict between the two.
Well, one can generalize this to the question of attitude. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said, the meaning of things lies in our attitudes to them, not the things themselves. And if you dwell on that, if you meditate a bit on what that means about our responsibilities to formulate our attitudes, to take the time to think, in the way that philosophical reflection, in the very broader sense, philosophical reflection is a kind of constant preparation for life, thinking a bit about how you would meet loss, how you deal with grief, how you deal with success and triumph and the rest. What kind of mindset you work to make and by which to live your life. Those sorts of examples, Huxley's example, Darwin's own, and others, are exemplary for this reason, that in general, as it were, epistemological terms, the idea of being able to live with open questions, without resolution, without solutions to problems, is a very courageous and adventurous mindset. I sometimes think that one of the impulses, and there are many, to accepting a religious view of the world is that it provides a narrative and closure, and it's very neat, it's got a beginning and an end, and it's got some solace attached to the story about the end. Whereas science gives us something very open-ended and inconclusive that you have to live with, not knowing what the answers are yet, but being prepared to seek them, to carry on looking for them, and to struggling with the new and sometimes more difficult questions that arise when you do come up with some solutions. And so it is with personal life, thinking about how you're going to accept the inevitability of loss or grief. So, for example, the minute that you enter into a relationship with another person, especially if you love that other person, one or other of you thereby contracts for loss. You know, if you marry somebody, one of you is going to die before the other one does. Loving somebody is buying into a certainty that there's going to be hurt involved in it at some point. But to recognize that that, in fact, is part of the value of what you've done, and to accept that it's in this life now and in the span of that relationship that all the best that you can make out of it must be made. Now, that seems to me to be deep and courageous, that view of life. Whereas, you know, sticking with a sort of reflex view that, oh, it all doesn't matter because you'll all meet up again later, or, you know, everything's going to come right in the end, is, you know, it's a kind of shallow, inexpensive view of life, if you like.
So you have a fondness for Stoics?
Well, I think the Stoics are a very, very interesting bunch of people. And in fact, of course, a great deal of Stoicism was imported into Christianity late on, when the sort of early ethics of the New Testament were seen to be just pro tem. You know, the end of the world was coming, and when it didn't come, they needed some decent ethics, and so they went and plundered it from the Stoics. So,
who's your favourite philosopher?
Well, I have to tell you that I'm really against beauty contests. You know, who's your favourite this and the biggest that and the tallest the other and so on. But there are so many I admire.
Who influenced you the most in your thinking?
Well, it's hard to say that. I mean, I think in my sort of more technical work, I suppose Kant and Aristotle, people like that have been big influences. But somebody I regard as having been quite an exemplary philosopher, both in the technical sense and in the more public sense, would be somebody like Bertrand Russell. Now, there was a man who, you know, whatever else you think about him, at least spoke his mind, and I think made quite serious and important contributions to social changes. That book of his, for which he won the Nobel Prize, published in the early 30s, Marriage and Morals, was a book which, if you were to trace its influence in thinking in the post-war period, were probably a very significant one. So the social and moral revolution of the 50s and 60s may have something to do with what Russell had to say. If true, that shows you that philosophy does bake bread.
What about if you had a chance? This is not quite the same thing as a beauty contest, but if you had a chance to sit down for dinner with somebody in historical or wherever, who would you like to have spoken to?
Yeah, crumbs. That's another very, very difficult one, because almost everybody is the answer. But I wouldn't mind. I was very sad, actually. I was an undergraduate when Russell himself died, and I thought, damn, I should have done something about trying to get in touch with him before he died and speak to him. I know there may be people here who did meet him or hear him lecture, but that would have been fun. I think for sort of purely philosophical reasons, there are some questions I'd like to ask Frege and Kant. Now, I suppose I would just have to give one hell of a big dinner party, because there are so many people who would want to talk to.
See who would come to it. Are there any discoveries that you'd have liked to have made? Anything in your...
Well, I wouldn't have minded, coming up with the general theory of relativity, for example. That would have been fun.
Yeah.
But I think what I would like now is, above all else, to discover a way of persuading everybody to leave kids alone from the point of view, small children alone, from the point of view of proselytizing them with religious beliefs. If we could only just leave children to, get on with a standard course of education, perhaps learn about all the mythologies and the religions of the past, but without being persuaded by parents or schools or society into one or another religious commitment before they're in a position to evaluate it properly, then I'm sure the influence of religion in society would be considerably less.
Was there any religious influence when you were growing up? from your
No,
parents?
none. I was in a completely non-religious family. But then what happened was I was at school one day. We used to have to go to chapel